The moment Ethan Cole stepped through those saloon doors, he had one rule: don't get involved. He'd buried a wife, lost a son, and survived a war that broke better men than him. Getting involved was how a man like him started caring again. And caring was the one wound he couldn't survive twice. But when Victor Langston's hand cracked across Lydia Harper's face in front of a room full of cowards who looked the other way, Ethan's rule died right there on the saloon floor. And everything terrible that followed began in that single moment of no return. If this story already has your heart, go ahead and subscribe, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1878 came to Dust Ridge the way trouble always did. Slow at first, then all at once. By the middle of July, the heat had already killed 2 cattle hands out on the eastern flats, and cracked the painted sign above the telegraph office clean down the middle. The well on the south end of Main Street had been running low since May. Tempers had been running shorter than that. But inside the Broken Spur Saloon, the whiskey was cold enough, and the ceiling fans stirred just enough dead air to make a man feel like he might survive the afternoon. Ethan Cole had been nursing the same glass of rye for the better part of an hour. He wasn't much for drinking fast. Drinking fast led to talking, and talking led to people knowing your name, and knowing your name led to all manner of complications a drifter couldn't afford. He'd learned that particular lesson somewhere between Shiloh and the unmarked grave he'd left behind in Missouri 4 years ago. He kept his hat low, his eyes up. That was the other thing about Ethan Cole. He always kept his eyes up, so he saw it before most of the room did. Victor Langston came through the side door the way he always came through every door in Dust Ridge, like the building had been constructed for the specific purpose of framing his entrance. He was a big man, thick through the chest, with silver at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from quarry stone. He wore a white shirt with pearl buttons despite the heat, and 2 men flanked him like shadows that had learned to walk upright. He moved to the far end of the bar. He snapped his fingers. Lydia Harper was there before the sound finished echoing. Ethan had noticed her earlier. It was hard not to. She moved through that saloon the way water moved, fast, efficient, finding every gap between tables and elbows and outstretched boots without a single wasted motion. Her dark hair was pinned up in the back, but a few strands had come loose from the afternoon heat and curled at her neck. She couldn't have been more than 28. Her eyes were the color of good Kentucky bourbon, warm and deep, and nothing close to soft. She set a glass in front of Langston without being asked. He didn't even look at it. Lydia. His voice had that particular texture that powerful men cultivated. Low, practiced, the kind that expected the room to quiet itself just because he'd opened his mouth. "I was at the bank this morning." "Is that so?" she said, not a question. Her hands were already moving, wiping down the bar in slow, even strokes. "Had an interesting conversation with Hollis." He picked up the glass, swirled it once, set it back down. "Seems your father is 4 months behind." "My father handles the books." "Your father," Langston said, "handles the books the same way he handles everything else. Poorly." The rag stopped moving. 2 men at the nearest table shifted in their chairs. A card game 3 seats down went very quiet. "I'll pass along your concern," Lydia said. Her voice was flat and even and gave away exactly nothing. Ethan recognized that kind of control. He'd seen it in men who'd spent time in prisoner camps. The particular discipline of someone who had learned that any visible crack would be exploited immediately. Langston reached out and caught her wrist. Not violently, not yet. Just firmly enough to stop her from turning away. I don't think you understand what I'm telling you, he said. Mr. Langston, her chin came up. I'm working. You're always working. His thumb moved across her wrist in a slow arc. That's going to have to change. Let go of my wrist. Your father owes me $1,100. His voice dropped lower, though not quieter, the opposite of quieter. Quieter than quiet, somehow. The kind of low that filled a room. The note comes due in 30 days. Hollis tells me there isn't $1,100 in the county that your father could lay hands on. Then he'll find another way. There isn't another way. Langston finally looked at her, full in the face, and there was something in that look that turned Ethan's stomach. Not rage, not cruelty exactly, but a kind of flat, calculating patience. The look of a man who had already decided how this ended, and was simply watching events catch up to his conclusion. But I'm a reasonable man. I've always been reasonable with your family. You've always been. I have a proposal. Lydia went very still. A business arrangement, he said. One that settles the debt, keeps your father in his saloon, keeps this town running the way it's been running. Mr. Langston, I think you'd make a fine addition to the Langston household. The silence that followed was a particular kind. The kind where every man in the room hears something ugly said plainly, and chooses, individually and collectively, to look somewhere else. Ethan looked directly at it. Lydia pulled her wrist back. This time he let her, but slowly, finger by finger, like he was doing her a favor. I think, she said, that you should finish your drink and go. I think, Langston said, that you should think very carefully before you speak to me that way in front of my men. I think she told you to let go. The voice came from the far end of the bar. Every head in the room turned. Ethan had set down his glass. He was standing up straight now, his hat pushed back just enough that his face was visible. He wasn't a particularly remarkable-looking man at first glance, trail-worn, lean, with a kind of weathered face that could have been anywhere between 35 and 50. But there was something in the way he stood, something that took up more space than his actual body accounted for. Langston turned slowly, like a man who'd never once in his life needed to rush. I don't believe I know you, he said. No, Ethan agreed. You don't. Then I'd suggest you sit back down and finish your drink, friend, before you say something that costs more than you've got. I ain't your friend. Ethan's voice was unhurried, almost gentle. And I already finished my drink. One of Langston's men, the broader one, standing to his left, took a half step forward. His hand drifted toward his hip. Ethan looked at him. Just looked. The man stopped moving. Langston studied Ethan for a long moment. His expression didn't change, exactly, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalibration. The flat calculation turning itself toward this new variable. You're a drifter, he said finally. Not an insult, an assessment. That's right. Passing through. Was. Langston picked up his glass and drained it in one smooth motion. Set it down. Straightened his cuffs. You should know, he said pleasantly, that there are approximately 30 men in this territory who ride for my brand, and every one of them would shoot a stranger dead in the street for considerably less than what you just did. Probably, Ethan said. Langston looked at him a moment longer. Then he smiled. It was a terrible smile. Not angry, not vengeful, not anything that immediate. Just patient. Enjoy Dust Ridge, he said, while you can. He walked out. His men followed. The room let out its breath. Ethan picked up his hat, turned it once in his hands, and sat back down. He pulled his empty glass toward him and studied it like it contained something worth studying. A moment later, Lydia appeared across from him, She didn't say anything right away. She picked up his glass, refilled it without asking, and set it back in front of him. Her hands were completely steady. He noticed that. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "Probably not. He'll remember you now." "He was already going to remember you." Ethan looked up at her. "That didn't seem to stop you from telling him no." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise. Somewhere in between. She folded her arms and leaned against the back counter and studied him, the way a woman studies something she hasn't decided what to do with yet. "You're not from here," she said. "No." "Where are you from?" "Missouri, originally." "Originally," she repeated. "And now?" "Wherever the horse stops." He took a sip of the rye. "This is good whiskey." "My father blends it himself." Her eyes went briefly to the door Langston had walked through. "He's proud of that." "He should be." Ethan set the glass down. "How bad is it? The debt?" She looked at him sharply. "That's not your business." "No," he agreed easily. "It's not." Another silence. Outside, the heat pressed down on the street and made the air between the buildings shimmer and twist. Somewhere up the block, a dog was barking at something it couldn't reach. $1,100, she said quietly, which might as well be 11,000. She picked up the rag again, started moving it in those slow, even arcs. "My father took out the note 3 years ago when the saloon needed a new roof and a new bar, and the distillery equipment all needed replacing at once. Langston offered him favorable terms." Her mouth curved briefly, without warmth. "They were favorable terms, at the time." "And now?" "Now the interest has doubled what was originally borrowed, and my father—" She stopped, started again. "My father is a good man. He is not a careful man. Those are two very different things." "I know the type," Ethan said. "Langston's been waiting," she said. "That's what I didn't understand for a long time. He wasn't careless with those terms. He was patient. He knew my father. He knew exactly what would happen." She set the rag down and looked directly at Ethan. "He's been waiting for an excuse to walk through that door and make exactly the offer he just made." "The business arrangement. Is that what he called it?" It wasn't a question. Ethan looked at her steadily. "You're not going to take it." "No," she said. "I'm not." "Good." "It doesn't matter," she said. "Good doesn't have a lot of practical value in Dustridge when Victor Langston is on the other side of the argument." She picked up the rag again, looked down at the bar. "You should ride out tomorrow morning, Mr. Cole. Ethan Cole." "Mr. Cole." She met his eyes again. "You should ride out tomorrow, before he sends someone to find out who you are." "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. "You're probably right." He did not ride out the next morning. He told himself it was the horse. The animal had thrown a shoe 2 days back, and the replacement job the liveryman had done in the last town wasn't holding the way it should, and a man who pushed a lame horse across open desert in July heat was asking to die on foot with no water and no shade. That was a reasonable explanation. It had the advantage of being partially true. He also told himself it was the whiskey, which was genuinely exceptional, and the cot above the general store that the proprietor rented by the week for less than he'd paid for a night's lodging in the last 3 towns combined. These were the things he told himself. He did not examine too closely the fact that he spent the better part of the following morning sitting on the bench outside the hardware store with a cup of bad coffee, watching the Broken Spur Saloon across the street. He did not examine it because he recognized it, and recognizing it made something hurt behind his sternum, that he'd worked 4 years to stop feeling. It was the morning of his 3rd day in Dustridge when Samuel Harper found him. The older man came across the street with a purposeful stride that didn't quite disguise the slight drag in his left leg. An old injury, Ethan guessed, from the way he favored it without seeming to notice he was doing it. He was in his late 50s, barrel-chested, with white hair and a thick mustache, and the blunt, sunburned hands of a man who had worked outdoors most of his life before the saloon. He pulled up in front of Ethan's bench and stood there with his hands on his hips. "You're Cole," he said. "That's right. I'm Samuel Harper. The broken spur is mine." He paused, seemed to be weighing something. "My daughter told me what happened 2 nights ago." "I stepped into something that was none of my business," Ethan said. "Shouldn't have." "No," Samuel said. "You shouldn't have." But his voice didn't carry the edge of reproach. It carried something more complicated. "Langston sent a man by this morning, early, before we were even open." He sat down heavily on the bench beside Ethan, which was apparently what he'd intended to do all along. "Wants to know who you are, where you're from, what you're doing in Dustridge." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know any more than he did." Samuel took off his hat and turned it in his hands. His face, up close, was a map of a difficult life. Not unhappy exactly, but weathered by things that hadn't been easy. "I should tell you to leave. That's the smart thing, the right thing. But I watched Victor Langston put his hand on my daughter, in my saloon, in front of 20 men, and not a single one of them moved." He put his hat back on. "You moved." Ethan said nothing. "I've been in this town 22 years, Samuel said. "Built that saloon from the ground up. My wife is buried here." His voice dropped on that last sentence. "This is my home." And somewhere in the last 5 years, it stopped feeling like one. He looked at Ethan. "You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand." "I'm not asking you to do anything," Samuel said quickly. "I'm not a man who asks strangers for help. I'm not—" He stopped, rubbed his face with one big hand. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did, and to tell you that if you're looking for work while your horse heals up, I could use a man behind the bar." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "Bar work," he said. "It's honest." "I've done worse," Ethan said. He started that evening. The broken spur, up close and over time, told a different story than it did at first glance. It was a good saloon, well kept, better stocked than it had any right to be given the town's circumstances, with a long, polished bar that Samuel clearly maintained with care, and tables that were replaced and repaired the moment they showed wear. The piano in the corner was out of tune, but played by a man named Rupert, who had, against all odds, a genuine gift for it. It was a place that had been built with love by someone who knew what he was doing, and was watching it slowly come apart. The debt hung over it the way heat hung over the valley, invisible until you reached for something and felt it pressing back. Ethan learned the shape of it over the first week. He learned it from the regulars who drank too carefully, watching what they said. He learned it from the way Samuel's hands shook slightly when he looked at the books in the back room and thought no one was watching. He learned it from the conversations that stopped when Langston's men came through the door, which they did every few days for no particular reason, just to remind the room of something. And he learned it from Lydia. She worked the room the way she did everything, efficiently, with that careful control over her own face and voice that he'd noticed the first night. But he was behind the bar now, which meant he was close enough to see the things she didn't show the room. The slight tension in her jaw when one of Langston's men lingered too long at a table. The way her hands moved faster when she was angry. the particular silence she maintained when her father's name came up in certain kinds of On the fifth evening, after the last customer had gone, and Samuel had retreated to the back to do his nightly accounting, she stayed to help Ethan close up. They moved around each other in the easy shorthand of people who had figured out each other's rhythms without making a project of it. "You're still here," she said, not looking up from the glasses she was stacking. "Horse isn't ready," he said. "The liveryman told my father, your horse has been ready for 4 days." Ethan set down the bottle he was shelving. "Did he?" "He did." She looked at him. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes weren't. They were direct and sharp and not unkind. "So why are you still here, Mr. Cole?" He thought about giving her a different answer, the kind of answer that would be easier for both of them. Instead, he said, "I'm not sure yet." "That's not an answer." "It's an honest one." She considered this. "Langston is going to push harder," she said. "Now that he knows you're still in town and working here, it gives him a reason to push harder. That's how he works. He doesn't come at you directly. He finds the pressure points, and he leans on them until something gives." "I know men like him," Ethan said. "Do you?" "I commanded men like him once. In the war." He picked up the bottle again, put it in its place. They weren't usually the ones doing the fighting. They were the ones deciding who got sent into which field, and who got to stay back from it. And they were always absolutely certain that whatever they did, they had good reasons. His voice was even, distant from itself in the particular way of someone recounting facts they've sorted through many times. Afterward, they were usually the first ones to take what the war left behind. She was quiet for a moment. "What did it leave behind? Where you were?" "Missouri." He picked up a rag and started wiping down the bar. "Farmland mostly. Some of the best in the county." His hands moved in slow, even strokes. She recognized them, he thought. The same strokes she used. "My wife's family had been there 3 generations. After the war, men with capital came in and bought up the debts. 2, 3 years, and they owned half the county." "Your wife's family?" "My wife," he said. "And my son." He was 4. He stopped. The rag stopped. He folded it once, precisely, and set it on the bar. "Fever. The winter of 74. The farm was already gone by then. He paused. "I'd been gone most of that winter, looking for work." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It had weight, but it was the weight of something understood, not the weight of something awkward. "I'm sorry," Lydia said quietly. "I rode out in the spring," he said. "Kept riding." He looked up at her. "I was only supposed to pass through here." She looked back at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not pity, he was relieved to see. Something more honest than pity. "You should still go," she said. "You should go before Langston makes you part of this." "Maybe," he said. "He will ruin you if he can," she said. "That's not a warning, Mr. Cole. That's just a description of what Victor Langston does to things he can't control." "Lydia." He said her name, and she seemed briefly startled by it. The first name, the directness of it. "What is he planning to do, specifically, to you?" She looked away, looked at the door, looked at the glasses she'd stacked on the shelf with such perfect precision. "He's given my father 30 days from the date he spoke to me at the bar," she said. "If the debt isn't settled—" She stopped. "He'll take the saloon, and then he'll make the offer again, and the circumstances will be considerably less negotiable." "You'll still say no?" "Yes," she met his eyes. "And then something will happen to my father." Her voice didn't waver. but he heard everything underneath it. The fear she wasn't going to show him. The calculation she was already running. Something that will look like an accident, or a robbery, or a heart attack brought on by the stress of his circumstances. And then Langston will be very concerned and very sympathetic. And he'll bury my father and offer to take the saloon off my hands for a decent price. And then the offer will come again. And at that point, I'll be 28 years old, with nothing, and no one, and no— She stopped herself. Ethan looked at her. "I have been thinking about this," she said, more quietly, "for a long time." "What do you want to do?" She blinked, like the question itself was unexpected, like it was a kind of question she hadn't been asked recently enough. "I want to keep my father alive," she said. "I want to keep this saloon. I want to live in my town without Victor Langston's hand on my wrist every time I turn around." She picked up the last glass and set it on the shelf with more force than necessary. "That's what I want. What I'm going to get is considerably less." "Maybe not," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't be the kind of man who says maybe not and makes me feel like there's something to hope for," she said. "I've been managing this on my own for long enough that I don't need—" She stopped again, took a slow breath, steadied herself. "I don't need a drifter who's going to ride out in 2 weeks to tell me that things might work out." "No," he said, "you don't." She waited, like she expected him to say something else. When he didn't, she picked up her apron and folded it. "Good night, Mr. Cole," she said. "Good night, Miss Harper." She walked to the back. Ethan stood behind the bar in the empty saloon and looked at the door she'd walked through for a long moment. Then he turned out the last lamp. In the dark and the heat and the particular quiet of a small western town after midnight, he stood very still. And for the first time in 4 years, something that had been still inside him for a long time began, very slowly, and not without considerable resistance, to move. He didn't know yet what that meant, but he was starting to understand why his horse had stopped here, and why his feet had refused, so far, to pick back up and carry him anywhere else. Outside, the summer heat pressed down on Dust Ridge like a hand that intended to stay. And somewhere across town, in the largest house in the valley, Victor Langston sat at his desk in the lamplight, turning a glass of whiskey slowly in his hands. Thinking about a drifter who had made the mistake of giving him something new to be patient about. 3 days after that conversation, Langston's man came back. Not to the saloon this time, to the livery stable, where Ethan was checking his horse's shoes in the early morning before the heat made the day impossible to move through. The man's name was Cade Pruitt. Ethan had already learned that much from the regulars at the Broken Spur. Langston's foreman. 15 years in service, and loyal in the particular way of men who had tied their fortunes so completely to someone else's that they no longer had any idea what they'd be without them. Pruitt came in alone, which was either a show of confidence or an insult, and Ethan decided it was probably both. "Mr. Cole." He stopped a few feet back. His thumbs were in his belt. "Mr. Langston would like a word." "Would he?" Ethan ran his hand down the horse's foreleg. "About what?" "About your plans. How long you're intending to stay." "My plans are my own business." "In most places," Pruitt said, "that's true." He shifted his weight. "In Dust Ridge, Mr. Langston takes an interest in things. People. Situations." He paused. "He'd like to have a conversation. Friendly." Ethan straightened up and looked at him. "If Langston wants to talk to me, he can walk into the saloon and sit down like anybody else." Pruitt studied him for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, like a man making a note of something. "I'll tell him that," he said. and left. Ethan watched him go and then turned back to the horse. His hands had stopped moving, made them start again. He told Lydia about it that evening. She was wiping down tables before opening, and she didn't stop moving when he told her, which she'd already learned meant she was controlling something. The impulse to react, most likely. Her hands kept working. Her face stayed even. "He won't come to the saloon," she said. "I know. That wasn't an actual invitation. That was him taking your measure." She moved to the next table. "He wanted to see whether you'd come when called. You didn't. So now he knows you're not intimidated. Which means he'll stop being indirect." "What does indirect look like in this town?" She paused. "It looks like the last 2 years." She set down the rag. "It looks like my father's debt quietly doubling. It looks like our supply contracts disappearing one by one when the merchants decided it was safer to do business with Langston's people instead. It looks like Sheriff Doyle riding past on his weekly rounds and never once stopping here when Langston's men are drinking until midnight and breaking chairs." She picked the rag back up. "Indirect is the only way Victor Langston has operated in this town since he decided he wanted it. Because as long as nothing looks like what it is, no one can organize against it." Ethan leaned against the bar. "And if he stops being indirect?" "Then something happens fast," she said, "and it won't be subtle." She was right. It took 4 more days. On a Tuesday morning, 2 of Langston's riders showed up at the grain merchants and had a long, quiet conversation about credit terms. That same afternoon, the man who supplied the broken spur with its weekly ice delivery sent Samuel a note explaining that his wagon had developed a mechanical problem that would prevent delivery for the foreseeable future. The ice delivery had never missed a single week in 7 years. The message was clear as a gunshot. Samuel came into the saloon that evening with the note in his hand and sat down heavily at the bar, and didn't say anything for a long time. Ethan poured him a glass of his own whiskey and set it in front of him, and didn't say anything either, because some things needed space before they needed words. Finally, Samuel said, "He's tightening the rope." "Yes, sir." "He's going to keep tightening it." Samuel turned the glass in his hands. "The ice is just the beginning. Next it'll be the flour merchant, then the brewery contract, then maybe the bank decides to call in a smaller note we have, just to make a point." He looked up at Ethan. "I've been watching this happen to other men for years. I always told myself I'd see it coming in time to do something about it." And I see it coming," Samuel said. "And I still don't know what to do about it." His voice was not self-pitying. It was the flat, exhausted voice of a man confronting the difference between the person he believed himself to be and the situation he actually found himself in. "He wants my daughter. That's what it comes down to. Not the land, not the saloon. He has enough of both. He wants Lydia because he's asked for things for 20 years in this valley, and no one has ever told him no. And she told him no." "She did," Ethan said. "And now he'll burn down everything she loves until she changes her answer." Samuel drained the glass, set it down. "What would you do?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I'd find out what he's afraid of," he said finally. "Men like Langston, they build all that power because something drives them. And whatever drives them is usually the same thing they're most afraid of losing." He picked up the glass and refilled it. "Find that, and you find something to push back with." Samuel looked at him with something new in his expression. "You're not just a barman." "No, sir," Ethan said. "I'm not." It was Rupert, the piano player, who gave Ethan the first piece. Rupert was a small, precise man in his 60s who had been in Dust Ridge longer than almost anyone, and had survived that long, Ethan suspected, by being so thoroughly uninteresting to powerful men that they had never once considered him a threat. He played his piano, He drank his one carefully measured glass of whiskey each evening, and he watched everything. He had the particular gift of someone who had spent 60 years being overlooked. He remembered everything he saw. He sat down next to Ethan at the bar on a slow Wednesday afternoon and said, without preamble, "Langston didn't always own this valley." Ethan looked at him. "Came here in '68, Rupert said. After the war. Had money. Confederate mostly, which wasn't worth much. But he'd converted enough of it before the end that he arrived with capital when nobody else did. But the first ranch from a widow whose husband hadn't come back from Virginia." He paused. "The interesting thing is, who else arrived that same year?" "Who?" "Man named Hargrove, federal land commissioner. Came to survey the territory and establish deed records." Rupert turned his glass slowly. "Left 6 months later with a significant amount of Langston's money and deed records that didn't quite match what was actually surveyed." Ethan was very still. "You saw this?" "I was younger and considerably less careful about what I walked in on," Rupert said. "And Langston was younger and not yet practiced at the particular subtlety he's developed since." He looked at his glass. "Half the land he owns in this valley, Mr. Cole. The deed records exist, but the original survey records that should support them are missing or altered." "Is there anyone who still has the original surveys?" Rupert looked at him. "There might be," he said carefully. "In a town like this, a man who's survived 20 years of Victor Langston has learned to keep certain things in very safe places." He got up from the bar, finished his drink, and walked back to his piano. Ethan didn't look after him. He picked up a glass and started polishing it, and stayed very still inside his own head for a long time. That night he told Lydia. She sat across the back table from him after closing, her arms folded, her face doing that thing it did when she was working through a problem she'd already halfway solved and needed to hear the remaining pieces out loud to finish. "Fraudulent land deeds," she said. "Potentially. That's federal territory law. Federal jurisdiction." "Yes." She looked at him. "Ethan." First name. He noticed it. He didn't think she did. "If we go to a federal marshal with accusations against Victor Langston and we are wrong, or we can't prove it, he will know within 24 hours. And then—" "I know. And if we're right, and we can prove it, but we move before we have everything we need—" "I know that too." "Then what are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that there's a weapon," he said. "I'm telling you it exists. I'm not telling you to use it yet." He leaned forward. "But Lydia, a man who is afraid of something moves differently than a man who isn't. I want you to watch him. The next time he comes in, or the next time you see him, I want you to watch whether there's anything that makes him careful, cautious, not threatening, careful." She was quiet for a moment. "He gets careful around the circuit judge," she said slowly. "Judge Alderman comes through twice a year, and Langston—" She stopped, her eyes sharpened. "He's always very accommodating, very generous. Alderman has always ruled in his favor in the land disputes, but Langston treats him like he's managing him, not like he trusts him." "Because he's managing him," Ethan said, "which means he's not certain of him." She stared at him. Something was building in her expression. Not hope exactly, which she'd told him she didn't want to feel. Something harder and more useful than hope. Something that looked like the early stages of a plan. "When does Alderman come through next?" Ethan asked. 8 weeks, she said. Maybe 7. "And the debt comes due in—" 22 days. Her voice was flat, but she didn't look away. "So we have a weapon we can't use in time." Ethan said nothing, because she was right, and telling her otherwise would have been the kind of useless comfort she'd already told him she didn't need. "Then we need time," she said. We need to slow him down." "How?" She unfolded her arms, put both hands flat on the table. "My father pays a partial settlement. Whatever we can scrape together, $500. Enough that Langston can't call the note without looking unreasonable, without looking like a man who refused a good-faith partial payment." She looked at Ethan. "He cares what this town thinks of him. It's part of the image, the reasonable man, the fair businessman. If we make a partial payment and he refuses it, he looks like what he is. He'll find another way to apply pressure." "Yes," she said, "he will. But it buys us time." She paused. "Where do we find $500 in 22 days? The answer to that question came unexpectedly from the town itself. Ethan hadn't fully understood until Rupert told him about the land deeds, the shape of what Langston had built in Dust Ridge. It wasn't just ownership. It was a specific architecture of dependency, where every merchant, every rancher, every working family in the valley was connected to Langston's interests in at least one way that made direct opposition feel impossible. Each person alone couldn't afford to push back. The calculation changed if they pushed together. He started having conversations, quiet ones, in the hours before the saloon opened, or in the back room after closing. The grain merchant, the blacksmith, the woman who ran the boarding house and had watched Langston's men intimidate her tenants for 3 years. The 2 ranch families on the western edge of the valley who had been watching their grazing rights slowly erode as Langston's fence lines crept outward. He didn't ask for money. He asked a different question. He asked, "What would it be worth to you if this changed?" And then he listened. Most of them said the same thing in different ways. They said they'd stopped believing it could change. They said they'd seen men try before and what happened to them. They said they had families and debts of their own, and they couldn't afford to be the one who stepped out front. Ethan said, "What if you weren't the one stepping out front?" One evening, Lydia came into the back room where he was making notes. Names, amounts, what each family was actually owed in land and rights and money that Langston had quietly extracted over the years. And she stood in the doorway and watched him for a long moment before she spoke. "They're talking about you," she said. "Around town. People are talking." He looked up. "Not badly," she said. "Just—" She crossed her arms. "You've spoken to 6 families in the last week. People notice things in a town this size." "I know." "Langston will notice." "Yes." She was quiet. Then, "The widow Caffrey came by this morning. Margaret Caffrey. Her husband died 2 winters back. She brought me $40. Her voice was carefully controlled. "She said it was for she called it the fighting fund." She looked at him. "Did you tell her to do that?" "No," he said. "I told her what we were trying to do. She made her own decision." Lydia was silent for a long moment. $60 came in through the back by noon, she said finally. "Small amounts. Cash. People I haven't spoken to in months." She stopped. He could hear her breathing. "Ethan." He waited. "They've been waiting," she said. Her voice had changed. Something had cracked open in it, just slightly. Something she'd been holding shut for a long time. "All this time, they've been waiting for someone to—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, got control of it. "They've been waiting for something to be possible." "People don't need someone to fight for them," Ethan said. "They just need to believe the fight isn't already lost before it starts." She looked at him across the small back room, in the lamplight, with 40 people's quiet faith sitting between them on the table in the form of notes and scrawled numbers. And for a moment, the careful control she kept on her face slipped completely. What he saw underneath it was not weakness. It was the opposite of weakness. It was the face of a woman who had been carrying something alone for a very long time, and had just, for the first time, felt someone else's hands on the weight. She turned around and walked back out before he could say anything. He listened to her footsteps cross the saloon floor, heard the front door open and close. Outside, the summer night pressed down on Dust Ridge with the particular heat that came after dark in July, when the ground gave back everything the sun had put into it all day. Somewhere out on the main street, a horse stood tied to the rail outside the telegraph office. Cade Pruitt's horse. Ethan had noticed it when he came in that evening. He thought about it now. Pruitt had no business at the telegraph office at that hour, which meant the telegram hadn't been sent for business purposes. It had been sent to tell someone that things in Dust Ridge were starting to move. Ethan sat very still in the back room and looked at his notes and understood with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent enough time in dangerous situations to recognize the particular feeling of a window beginning to close, that whatever they were going to do, the time to do it was shortening faster than 22 days suggested. Langston was patient, but patience had limits. And a drifter who had spent a week quietly building something out of the town's fear and grief and long-suppressed anger had just given Victor Langston a very good reason to stop being patient. The telegram came back the next morning. Ethan didn't see it, but he heard about it from 3 different people before 9 o'clock, which told him everything he needed to know about how fast Langston moved when he decided to move. Pruitt rode out to the Langston Ranch before sunrise. By the time the saloon opened its doors, Samuel Harper had received a formal notice delivered by Sheriff Doyle himself, folded in an official envelope with the county seal on the outside, like legality was something that could be borrowed from stationery. Samuel brought it to Ethan without opening it. "You read it," he said. Ethan opened it, read it once, set it on the bar. "He's calling the full note," he said. "Not 30 days. 10. Samuel sat down. "The partial payment strategy," Ethan started. "Won't matter now," Samuel said. His voice was very quiet. 10 days. We couldn't raise $1,100 in 10 days if every man in this valley emptied his pockets." He put both hands flat on the bar and stared at them. "He knows that." "He does. So this isn't about the money anymore." "It was never about the money," Ethan said. The door to the back room opened, and Lydia came out with a flour sack in her arms, stopped when she saw both their faces, and set the sack down slowly. She looked at the paper on the bar. She didn't pick it up. "How long?" she said. 10 days, her father said. She was still for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "All right." And she picked up the flour sack and carried it to the kitchen like a woman who had decided that the only thing left to do was keep moving. Ethan watched her go and felt something cold settle into his chest. Not fear, exactly. Something more specific. The particular feeling of a situation contracting around people he'd stopped being able to think of as strangers. He went to find Rupert. The old piano player was in his usual chair on the boarding house porch, having his morning coffee with the precise, unhurried ritual of a man who had survived 60 years by never being rushed into anything. He looked up when Ethan came up the steps and said, without any preamble, "I heard." "I need to know about the surveys," Ethan said. "Not eventually. Now." Rupert turned his coffee cup in his hands. "There are risks to—" "Rupert." Ethan kept his voice level. "He's called the note in 10 days. Whatever window existed for doing this the slow, careful way is closed. I need to know if the evidence exists and where it is." The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a woman named Agnes Teller. She runs the schoolhouse on the north end of town. Her husband was the county surveyor in '68. He died in '71. He paused. Before he died, he gave her a box, told her to keep it somewhere Langston's men would never think to look. Rupert's voice was careful. I don't know what's in it. I only know it exists because James Teller told me about it the week before he died. And James Teller was not a man who said didn't mean. Does Agnes know what's in it? Agnes knows it matters, Rupert said. Whether she knows exactly why is a different question. Ethan was off the porch before Rupert finished the sentence. Agnes Teller was 63 years old and approximately as movable as a fence post that had been in the ground for 40 years. She answered his knock with a dish towel in her hand and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had long since decided that most of what men brought to her door was not worth the interruption. "Mrs. Teller," he said, "my name is Ethan Cole. I work at the Broken Spur." "I know who you are," she said. "Everybody knows who you are." "Then you might know what's happening to Samuel Harper." Her expression shifted. Something came into it. Not surprise. Recognition. "Come in," she said. She had the box in a trunk under her bed, wrapped in oilcloth that had dried and cracked with age. She set it on her kitchen table and folded her hands and looked at it. "James told me the day might come when someone would need this," she said. "He also told me to be very certain of the person I gave it to." "How do you get certain?" Ethan asked. She looked at him steadily. "James said to ask one question." She paused. "Why are you doing this? Not what do you want? Why?" Ethan looked at her. He thought about Lydia's face when she'd said, "They've been waiting." He thought about Samuel sitting with his hands flat on the bar. He thought about the widow Caffrey's $40 and everything it represented. "Because it's the right thing," he said, "and because I'm tired of moving on." Agnes Teller looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed the box across the table. The surveys were there, all of them. Original field surveys from 1868, cross-referenced with the deed records that had been filed at the county office. And the discrepancies were not subtle. 11 parcels of land, totaling nearly 4,000 acres, with deed boundaries that extended significantly beyond what the original surveys documented. One parcel in particular, the largest, covering the prime grazing land on the valley's eastern slope, had a deed boundary that was simply fabricated. The survey line it referenced did not exist. Ethan sat at Agnes Teller's kitchen table for 20 minutes and understood exactly what James Teller had understood in 1871, that this evidence was both powerful enough to destroy Victor Langston and dangerous enough to get anyone who carried it killed. He also understood something else, something that changed the calculation entirely. He needed a federal marshal. Not in 7 weeks when Judge Alderman came through. Now. He went back to the saloon and found Lydia in the back room, working through the accounts with the focused intensity of a woman trying to find money that wasn't there. He set Agnes Teller's box on the table in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. "Is this?" "The original surveys, yes." Her hands stopped moving over the ledger. She opened the box, looked at the top document, and was silent for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were doing something complicated. "This is enough," she said. "This is more than enough." "It is," he said, "if we can get it to the right person." "The nearest federal marshal is in Abilene," she said immediately, like she'd already been thinking about it. 4 days' ride. Which means a man leaves today and gets back in 8 days, and we have 2 days to spare. "Langston will know someone left." She looked at him. "He has men watching the road." "Not every road." She stared at him. "You'd go through Cutter's Pass?" "I've ridden worse." "Men have died in Cutter's Pass in July. The heat alone." "Lydia." He met her eyes. "Do you trust me?" The question landed in the quiet of the back room and stayed there. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been carefully not doing for 2 weeks, in the same way he'd been carefully not looking at her. And then something shifted in her face, and the careful not looking was suddenly just looking, plain and direct and more honest than either of them had quite prepared for. "Yes," she said, simply, no qualification. He picked up the box. "Then I'll leave before dark." He didn't leave before dark. Pruitt was waiting at the stable, not alone this time. 2 riders with him, positioned with the casual deliberateness of men who wanted to look like they were just standing around and weren't good enough at it to quite pull it off. Pruitt himself leaned against the fence post with his arms crossed and watched Ethan come across the yard. "Heading somewhere?" he said. "Getting some air," Ethan said. "With your saddlebag packed?" Ethan stopped walking. He looked at Pruitt. He looked at the 2 men. He ran the arithmetic of the situation and didn't like the answer. "Mr. Langston would like a conversation," Pruitt said. "Tonight. He's been patient about that invitation, but I'm afraid his patience is running out." "I told you where he could find me." "Yes, sir, you did." Pruitt pushed off the fence post. "And I told him that. He said to tell you that he admires the stubbornness, but that this particular conversation would go better somewhere private." He paused. "He also said to tell you that he's aware of the box." Everything in Ethan went very quiet. Pruitt watched his face. "He'd like it back," he said, "along with a conversation about what it's going to take for you to ride out of Dust Ridge and not come back." Ethan stood in the stable yard in the last of the evening heat and understood, with complete clarity, exactly how badly he'd miscalculated the speed of Langston's information. Somewhere between Agnes Teller's kitchen and the saloon, someone had talked. Or Langston had already known about the box and had been waiting to see if anyone would go for it. He went. The Langston Ranch House was the largest building within 50 miles, and looked it. Ethan rode out under escort without speaking to Pruitt or either of his men, which suited everyone fine, and arrived to find Langston waiting on the front porch in a chair like a man who had nowhere to be and all of time to get there. "Mr. Cole," he gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." Ethan sat. Langston looked at the saddlebag. "I'll have that." "You'll have a conversation first," Ethan said. Langston almost smiled. "All right." He leaned back. "You're not what I expected when Pruitt described you." "What did you expect?" "A drifter with a grudge and nothing to lose. That type is easy." He studied Ethan with that flat, patient calculation. "You're something more specific. A man who's decided this particular fight is worth having." He tilted his head. "I'm curious why." "The Harpers are good people." "Lots of good people in the world, Mr. Cole. You haven't stopped for most of them." That landed closer than Ethan wanted to show. He kept his face still. "Maybe I've stopped now." "For a woman," Langston said. Not derisively, just flatly. "You've ridden into a war over a woman you've known for 2 weeks." "I've ridden into a situation that was already a war," Ethan said. "The woman is not the reason. She's the person the reason is standing next to." Langston was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The surveys are inadmissible." "That's not what a federal marshal will say." "A federal marshal would need to get here first." Langston's voice was very smooth. "And then he'd need to navigate the relationship between federal jurisdiction and county authority, which in this territory is a complicated matter that could take considerably longer than the 10 days remaining on Samuel Harper's note." He looked at Ethan. "I'm not a stupid man. I've had lawyers look at every angle of my position for 20 years. You've had 2 weeks and some old paper." "Then why am I sitting on your porch?" Ethan said. Langston looked at him. For the first time, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't calculation. something older and less comfortable. "Because I'm tired," he said. And in those two words, Ethan heard something he hadn't expected, the honest sound of a man who was telling about at least one thing. "I've been building this for 20 years. I'm 61 years old. I have everything I set out to have, and I'd like to stop fighting for it every single day." He looked out at the valley. "I want the Harper girl because she's the only woman in this valley who looks at me without flinching. And I'm old enough to know that's worth something I can't buy." The honesty of it was almost worse than the calculation. Ethan looked at this man, this genuinely terrible man who had spent 2 decades crushing everything around him into submission, and saw something that made the situation more complicated and not less. A loneliness so old and so deep it had turned into a kind of hunger that didn't know what it was hungry for anymore. "She doesn't want you," Ethan said. Not cruelly, just plainly. "She'd learn." "No," Ethan said, "she wouldn't. Because she's not afraid of you. And a woman who isn't afraid of you is a woman who will never learn to want what she doesn't want." He leaned forward. "You know that. That's why she matters to you. And it's the same reason this will never work the way you want it to." Langston looked at him for a long time. The calculation was back, fully back. Whatever had briefly surfaced had gone under again. "Give me the box," he said. "No." "Then I'll take it." He raised his hand. Pruitt appeared in the doorway behind Ethan. "And I'll have you escorted to the county line. You'll leave tonight. If you come back, I'll have you shot for trespassing." "And the Harpers?" "The Harpers will work out their arrangement with me without your interference." Ethan stood up. He handed over the saddlebag. Because he had no choice. Because Pruitt had a gun at his back, and 2 more men had appeared at the corner of the porch, and because dead men delivered nothing to anyone. He handed it over and watched Langston take it, and felt the loss of it like a physical thing. But he'd made a copy. Not of everything. There hadn't been time. But the 2 most critical surveys, the ones with the most obvious fabrications, the ones that no legitimate court could explain away. He'd spent an hour with Agnes Teller's good lamp and his own steady hand and a second sheet of paper. The copies were folded inside his boot. Pruitt rode him to the edge of the Langston property and stopped. "Keep riding," he said. "I will," Ethan said. "Tonight." He rode back to town. It was past midnight. The street was empty. He went to the saloon's back door and knocked 3 times, the way he and Lydia had agreed on the first week. And she opened it before he'd finished the 3rd knock. She'd been awake. She took one look at his face and stepped back to let him in. "He took the box," he said. Her face tightened. "Then it's over." "No." He pulled the papers from his boot, unfolded them on the table. She looked at them for a long moment without speaking. "It's not everything," he said. "But it's enough for a marshal to open an investigation, which is all we need. Not a conviction, not yet. An investigation. Because the moment a federal investigation opens, Langston can't move on your father's note without it looking like exactly what it is." She sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly. He noticed it only because her hands never shook. She pressed them flat on the table and looked at the copies and breathed. "Who goes?" she said. "I can't," he said. "He'll have the road watched for me specifically." He paused. "It needs to be someone he doesn't consider a threat." She looked up at him, and in the same moment they both thought of the same person. "Rupert," she said. "Rupert," he said. She almost smiled. It was the most exhausted almost smile he'd ever seen, and it did something to him that he didn't have words for. "A 60-year-old piano player riding to Abilene," she said. He's tougher than he looks. He'd have to be. She folded her hands on top of the papers. Ethan, if this doesn't work, if the marshal doesn't come in time, or Langston finds out and moves before, then we figure out what's next, he said. But we don't plan for it tonight. She looked at him, at this man sitting across her back table in the middle of the night with copied survey documents in his hands and nothing left to offer her but the honest truth. Why are you still here? She said. Not an accusation, a real question. The same one she'd asked before, but different now, deeper and more afraid of the answer. You know why, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that the silence between them became something with shape and weight. Then she looked down at her hands. I need you to still be here in 10 days, she said quietly. That's what I need. I'll be here. She nodded once, picked up the papers. I'll talk to Rupert in the morning. She went to bed. Ethan stayed at the back table in the dark. He'd been here a little over 2 weeks. He'd come in as a drifter with a lame horse and no intentions, and he was sitting now with copied land fraud documents and a woman's quiet voice telling him she needed him to stay. And somewhere out in the valley, Victor Langston was reading through the original surveys and deciding exactly how much further he was willing to go. The answer to that question arrived the following morning. Sheriff Doyle came through the saloon doors at 8 o'clock with his hat in his hands and an expression like a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to. He asked for Samuel. Samuel came out from the back. Lydia came with him. Doyle looked at the floor. Samuel, he said, I'm real sorry. I want you to know that. Samuel waited. There's been a report, Doyle said. Filed this morning. Stolen property. He finally looked up. The complaint names Ethan Cole. Claims he stole a gold pocket watch and $60 cash from a room at the boarding house. His voice was flat, practiced, ashamed. I've got a warrant. Livia's breath caught loud enough to hear. Samuel didn't move. That's a lie, he said. Yes, sir, Doyle said quietly. I expect it is. He looked at Ethan, who had come out from behind the bar. But it's a filed warrant, and I don't have a choice. He paused. You'll have a hearing. Mr. Langston has generously offered to post the bond himself, given the circumstances. Don't, Ethan said. Doyle stopped. Don't say the rest of that sentence, Ethan said. Don't tell me what the bond conditions are. Don't tell me what Langston's offer is. Because if you say it out loud, you'll have to hear yourself say it. And I think you'd rather not. Doyle stood there with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor and didn't say another word. Lydia looked at Ethan. Her face had gone the color of bleached cotton. If you're in custody, she started. I know, he said. Rupert can still go. That part still works. I know. He looked at her, at her father, at Doyle, standing there in the wreckage of his own conscience. And he said the only thing there was left to say. Don't wait on me, he said to Lydia. Whatever happens next, don't wait. She looked at him for a long moment with those bourbon-colored eyes and said absolutely nothing, which told him everything about whether she was going to listen. They put Ethan in the back room of the sheriff's office, which was less a jail cell than a storage room with a lock on the outside and a single window too small to matter. Doyle didn't look at him when he closed the door. That told Ethan more about the man's conscience than anything he could have said. He sat on the cot and listened to the town. That was all he could do. Listen. The sheriff's office sat close enough to the main street that sound carried through the walls. Wagon wheels, voices, the distant piano from the Broken Spur starting up in the early afternoon. Rupert's playing, which meant Rupert was still in town, still at the piano, hadn't left yet. Ethan pressed his back against the wall and worked through it. Rupert couldn't leave during the day, with Langston's men watching the roads. He'd have to go at night, which meant the marshal wouldn't arrive until day 9 at the earliest. The note came due on day 10. 1 day's margin, assuming everything went perfectly, and nothing in Ethan's experience had ever gone perfectly. He was still working through the arithmetic when the door opened. Not Doyle. Pruitt. He came in alone and stood in the middle of the room with his arms crossed and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man delivering a prepared speech he didn't particularly enjoy. "Mr. Langston wants you to understand that the charges can be dropped," he said. "Tonight, if necessary." "In exchange for what?" Ethan said. "Your horse is at the livery. Your gear is packed. You ride out tonight, and the warrant disappears by morning." "And the Harpers?" Pruitt's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not your concern anymore. What happens to them?" "Samuel Harper settles his debt according to the terms of the note," Pruitt said, "which is a legal and legitimate financial arrangement that has nothing to do with you." "And Lydia?" Pruitt was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. "Miss Harper makes her own choices." Ethan looked at him steadily. "You don't believe that?" "Mr. Cole, you've worked for this man 15 years, Ethan said. "You've watched him do this to people for 15 years. I'm asking you if you believe that what happens to Lydia Harper after I leave is her own choice." Pruitt's face did something complicated and brief, and then went flat again. "I'm giving you a way out," he said. "I'd take it." "I know you would," Ethan said. "That's the difference between us." Pruitt left without another word. Ethan sat in the hot silence of the back room and thought about Lydia. About what she was doing right now, in the hours since Doyle had walked him out of the saloon. He knew her well enough by now. 2 weeks was long enough if you paid attention. And he had paid more attention to Lydia Harper than he'd paid to anything in 4 years. To know that she was not sitting still. She was not waiting. She was moving, planning, doing the thing she always did when a wall went up in front of her, which was look for the door in it. He hoped she was being careful. He was fairly certain she wasn't. He was right. Across town, Lydia was sitting in Agnes Teller's kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, and Agnes was sitting across from her with the quiet, watchful patience of a woman who had held difficult information for 7 years and understood its weight precisely. "He took the originals," Lydia said. "Ethan made copies of 2 documents. Rupert has them. But I need to know, is there anything else? Anything that wasn't in the box?" Agnes looked at her for a long moment. "James kept everything in that box," she said. "Except one thing." She paused. "There was a letter from the Federal Land Commissioner, from Hargrove. James kept it separately because he said if Langston ever came for the box, he didn't want everything in one place." Lydia went very still. "A letter from Hargrove, dated 1869, acknowledging the payment." Agnes's voice was careful. "In writing." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when something changes irrevocably. Lydia set down the coffee cup. "Where is it?" "The schoolhouse," Agnes said. "In the floorboard under my desk. I haven't touched it in 6 years." Lydia stood up. "I need it today." Agnes didn't hesitate. She stood up too. They went together, quickly, through the back streets that Lydia had known since childhood and used now the way she used everything, efficiently, without waste. The schoolhouse was empty in the afternoon heat and smelled of chalk and old wood. Agnes went directly to her desk, moved it with Lydia's help, and pulled up the board with the practiced ease of someone who had done it once before and hoped never to do it again. The letter was wrapped in oilcloth, like the surveys had been, tied with a piece of cord. Agnes handed it to Lydia without a word. Lydia opened it, read it twice. Her hands were not shaking. She was past shaking. She was in the place she went when things got bad enough that her body simply decided to be useful instead of afraid. She'd been there before. She could function here. "This is a federal bribery document," she said quietly, "with Langston's name and the amount and the date." "Yes," Agnes said. "This doesn't just open an investigation. This is a conviction." "Yes," Agnes said again. Lydia folded it carefully and put it inside her dress, against her skin, where no one would find it without a fight. She looked at Agnes. "Thank you," she said, "for holding on to this, for all of it." Agnes looked at her with those old, steady eyes. "James always said the right person would come along eventually." She paused. "He just didn't say it would be a woman half my age who runs a saloon." "He wasn't wrong," Livia said. She went to find Rupert. He was between sets, sitting at the bar with his one measured glass, and when she slid onto the stool beside him and leaned close, he listened without any change in his expression, which she'd always appreciated about him. She told him about the letter. She watched his eyes change, not dramatically, just a deepening, a settling, like a man who has been holding his breath for years and has just been given permission to exhale. "Tonight," she said. "You leave tonight. There's a rancher named Cooper on the North Road, 3 miles out. He owes my father more than he can repay in money. He'll give you a fresh horse and won't tell a soul." She pressed the copied surveys and the letter, carefully refolded inside an envelope, into his hands under the bar. "Give all of this to the federal marshal. His name is Holt. Tell him what's happening. Tell him the note comes due in 9 days." Rupert put the envelope inside his vest without looking down. He picked up his glass. "What do you tell people when I'm not here tomorrow?" "That you got a letter from your sister in Dallas and left in a hurry," she said. "I don't have a sister." "Nobody here knows that." He almost smiled. He drank the last of his whiskey. "Lydia." He set the glass down with his usual precision. "Your father doesn't know about this letter." "No." "He should." "I know." She looked straight ahead at the bar. "I'm going to tell him tonight, after I do one more thing." The one more thing was Doyle. She found him in his office, alone, at his desk, with the look of a man who is becoming intimately acquainted with the person he'd allowed himself to become, and found the company unpleasant. He looked up when she came in, and then looked back down, which was answer enough. She sat down across from his desk without being invited. "I'm not here to make you feel worse," she said. He looked up again. "Miss Harper, I'm here to tell you that in approximately 8 or 9 days, a federal marshal is going to arrive in Dustridge with a bribery warrant for Victor Langston." She kept her voice level, factual, like she was discussing weather. "When that happens, every arrangement Langston has made in this county is going to come under federal scrutiny, including his arrangements with the sheriff's office." Doyle's face had gone gray. "I'm also here to tell you," she continued, "that there's a man in your back room on false charges that you know are false. And that man being in your back room instead of free is the only thing standing between Victor Langston and the time he needs to make the next move." She looked at him. "You have one chance to be on the right side of this. One. And it's tonight." Doyle stared at her. His hands were flat on the desk. She could see them trembling slightly. "He'll destroy me," he said. "He's going to destroy you anyway," she said. "The only question is whether you go down with him or whether you spend the next 9 days being the man your badge says you are." She stood up. "Ethan Cole did not steal anything. You know that. The charges are false, and they were filed under your authority, and your name is on that warrant." She looked at him. "What are you going to do with that?" She walked out. She walked back to the saloon. She went into the back room and sat across from her father and told him everything. The surveys, the letter, Rupert, Doyle, all. She watched his face move through shock and anger and grief and something that looked, painfully, like relief. The relief of a man who has been carrying guilt alone for years and has finally been allowed to set it down and look at it honestly. When she finished, Samuel was quiet for a long time. "You've been carrying all of this," he said. "Since when?" "Since I realized you'd blame yourself," she said. "And blaming yourself wouldn't help." He looked at her. His eyes were red at the edges. "Lydia." "Don't," she said, gently. "Don't apologize. Just tell me what you need, and let's figure out the next 9 days." He straightened in his chair. Something went back into his spine. "Tell me what to do," he said. She told him. The night was long and hot and moved with the particular slowness of nights when too much depends on things you can't control. Lydia stayed awake, staying busy, staying useful the way she knew how. The saloon closed at its normal hour. The customers left in their normal way. Langston's man at the corner table, there was always one now, had been for a week, finished his drink and left with the rest of them. An hour later, in the deep quiet of after midnight, she heard the back door. She was there before the second knock. She opened it, and Ethan Cole walked in. She stared at him. "How—" "Doyle," he said. She closed her eyes for a single second, then opened them. "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for 2 weeks. That steady, careful look that she'd been pretending not to notice and had been failing to pretend for at least a week. "You went to see Doyle?" "I did." "What did you say to him?" "I told him the truth," she said. People respond to that sometimes. He stood in her doorway, trail dusty from however he'd come through the back streets to avoid being seen, and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something that had been held back for a long time had stopped being held back. It was in his eyes, and in the set of his jaw, and in the way he was standing, very still, like a man who had decided to stop moving away from something. "The letter," he said. "Agnes Teller's letter. Rupert has it?" "Rupert left 2 hours ago," she said. "Through the North Road. Cooper's horse." He was quiet for a moment. "You did all of that tonight." "There wasn't another night available," she said. "Lydia." He said her name the way he had that first evening, direct and quiet. And it did the same thing it had done then, made something steady in her chest go briefly unsteady. "Come here." She didn't move immediately. She looked at him standing in her doorway, in the middle of the night, having walked out of a jail cell because she'd talked a broken man back to his conscience, and she felt the full weight of everything the last 2 weeks had been. The fear she hadn't shown anyone, the exhaustion she'd been running past, the particular loneliness of being the person who keeps everything moving when everything is falling apart. Then she crossed the 3 feet between them, and he put his arms around her, and she let him. She didn't cry. She wasn't a woman who cried easily. But she pressed her face against his shoulder, and she breathed, for the first time in what felt like weeks, without calculating anything. He held her like a man who understood the difference between holding someone because they needed it and holding someone because you couldn't imagine not doing it anymore. His hand came up to the back of her head. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They stood like that in the dark of the back room until her breathing steadied. Then she stepped back. She looked at him. He looked at her. The thing that had been building between them since that first night at the bar was no longer something either of them was pretending they didn't see. 9 days, she said. 9 days, he agreed. You can't be seen in town. Langston will have another warrant filed by morning." "I know." He looked around the back room. "There's a place above the old feed store on the East End. The owner is one of the families I talked to. He offered—" "I know the place," she said. "I know Tom Briggs. I'll send word to him tonight." She paused. "You can't come to the saloon." "No." "I'll find ways to get you information." She folded her arms. Old habit. Control. "Ethan." His name again, and she noticed this time that she'd stopped noticing when she used it. "If Langston figures out that Rupert has gone, he'll move on your father before the 9 days," Ethan said. "Yes, I know. What do we do?" He was quiet for a moment, not the hesitant quiet of a man without an answer, the particular quiet of a man who has an answer he's sorting through carefully before he speaks it. "Every family I talked to," he said, "every one of them said they couldn't be the one to step out front." He met her eyes. "But if Langston makes a move before the marshal gets here, public, visible, the kind of move that can't be explained away, then they're not stepping out front. They're responding. And that's different." She understood immediately. "You want him to make a mistake." "I want him to do what men like him always do when they feel the ground shifting," Ethan said. "I want him to push too hard, too fast, in front of too many witnesses." "And if he does something to my father before there are witnesses?" "Then we make sure he's never alone," Ethan said. "Samuel. He doesn't open alone. He doesn't close alone. He doesn't step outside without someone who matters next to him." He looked at her. "Not because your father can't take care of himself. Because it needs to cost Langston more than it's worth." She nodded, slowly, working through it. "Margaret Caffrey has been asking what she can do," she said. "And Tom's wife. And the Hendersons." She looked at him. "Women, mostly. The men are still afraid." "Women are enough," he said, without hesitation, like it was obvious. And the way he said it, like it genuinely hadn't occurred to him to think otherwise, did something in her chest that was entirely separate from strategy. "All right," she said. "Go to Tom's. I'll send word in the morning." He picked up his hat. He looked at her. "You're the most capable person I've ever met," he said. Simple, direct, not flattery, just a fact he was choosing to say out loud. She looked back at him. "Don't make me like you too much," she said. "It's inconvenient under the circumstances." He almost smiled, the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen on him yet. He put his hat on and went out the back. She stood in the empty room for a moment. Then she started writing notes to Margaret Caffrey and Tom Briggs's wife and the Henderson women and 4 others in her clear, economical hand, asking for something specific and manageable from each of them. Something that would cost Langston the one thing his money couldn't replace: witnesses. The next 6 days moved like something with gears, grinding, purposeful, and occasionally alarming. Samuel never opened or closed alone. Margaret Caffrey took to sitting in the saloon every morning over coffee, staying until noon, which no one could object to because she was a paying customer, doing nothing more than drinking coffee and talking to whoever sat down. The Henderson sisters started stopping in for lunch. Tom Briggs's wife, Clara, took to doing her shopping at the times when Langston's men were most likely to be in the street, timing it with a precision she attributed to coincidence, and that fooled absolutely no one. Langston felt it. Ethan heard it through the network of small messages that moved between Tom's feed store and the back door of the Broken Spur, with the particular efficiency of people who have decided to stop being afraid. Langston had called Pruitt in twice, had ridden to town himself on day 5 and stood outside the Broken Spur for a long moment, and then ridden away, which was more unnerving than anything he'd done openly. On day 6, a rider came through from the east. Nobody Ethan recognized. He stopped at the saloon, had one drink, left. An hour later, Samuel sent a boy to Tom Briggs's store with a note that said only, "About Rupert." Ethan read it and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he put on his hat and started moving. Langston knew, which meant the timeline had just collapsed from 3 days to hours, which meant the marshal was either close enough to matter or he wasn't, and there was no longer any way to know which meant the only thing left was to make sure that whatever Langston did next, he did it in front of every witness they'd spent 6 days assembling. He sent 3 notes, one to Lydia, one to Margaret Caffrey, one to Tom Briggs. Each one said the same thing in different words. Tomorrow morning, be there. Then he sat in the dark of Tom's feed store and waited for the morning, and thought about Lydia, and tried not to think about all the ways this could still go wrong. He didn't sleep. He'd stopped expecting to. Just before dawn, a sound outside made a move to the window. In the street below, 3 horses stood tied to the rail outside the broken spur. Langston's brand on the saddles, visible even in the gray pre-dawn light. And coming around the corner, on foot, unhurried as a man taking an evening stroll, was Victor Langston himself. Not Pruitt, not hired men with a warrant. Langston, personally. Which meant he was done being patient. Which meant whatever happened in the next few minutes was going to happen fast, and without the careful audience they'd spent 6 days building. Because it was not yet dawn, and the street was empty, and Langston had timed this exactly right. And Ethan was already running for the stairs before the thought finished forming. Ethan hit the street at a dead run. The pre-dawn air was still thick with heat, the kind that never fully left in July, and the town was silent in the particular way of places that hadn't yet decided to wake up. 3 horses at the rail. Langston already through the saloon's front door, which meant he hadn't knocked, which meant he'd come with a key or with a boot, and neither option was good. Ethan came through the back. He heard it before he saw it. Samuel's voice, sharp and angry, and underneath it, a sound that turned his stomach cold. A sound he recognized from too many years of situations where someone with power had decided that the performance of civility was no longer necessary. The flat, hard sound of a man who had stopped pretending. He came through the kitchen door into the saloon and took in the room in 1 second. Langston had Samuel by the collar of his shirt, backed against the bar. 2 of his men stood near the front door. Pruitt was absent, which meant this was off-book, even by Langston's standards. Something personal that he didn't want his foreman to witness or later report. Lydia was on the stairs, halfway down, having come from her room above at the noise, her hair loose and her eyes fully awake, and her right hand gripping the stair rail with enough force to whiten her knuckles. "Let him go," Ethan said. Every head turned. Langston looked at him across the saloon with an expression of pure, cold fury that had finally stopped wearing the mask of patience. "You," he said. "You are supposed to be gone." "I keep hearing that," Ethan said. He moved into the room, keeping his distance from the 2 men at the door, reading their positions, reading the distance to Langston. "Let Samuel go. Step back, and we can have whatever conversation you came here to have." "I'm done having conversations." Langston's grip on Samuel's collar tightened. Samuel's face was red, and his hands were at Langston's wrist, and he was a big man, Samuel. But 60 years and a bad leg, and a lifetime of not being a violent man, put him at a specific disadvantage with someone who had never once in his life stopped himself from doing what he wanted to do. "I have a note that comes due in 3 days, and a piano player who has apparently taken a sudden interest in travel, and a drifter who should have been in the next territory 2 weeks ago. His voice had gone to something raw and stripped. "This ends tonight." "How?" Ethan said. "Tell me exactly how you think this ends." "Samuel signs the saloon over to me. Tonight. Right now." He looked at Lydia on the stairs. "And you come down those stairs and you act like a woman with sense for the first time since I've known you." Lydia came down the stairs, not because he told her to, at her own pace, with her chin up and her eyes on Langston, and the expression on her face of someone who has thought through what they're about to say and decided it's worth the cost. She stopped at the bottom step, which put her at a slight height advantage, and she used it. "Victor," she said, his first name, flat and deliberate. "Look at where you are. Look at what you're doing. You came to my father's home before sunrise and put your hands on him." Her voice was steady as iron. "This is who you are. Not the man who owns the valley. Not the reasonable businessman. This, right here." Something crossed Langston's face. Not shame. Men like him had long since made their peace with the absence of shame. But something adjacent to it. The particular discomfort of being seen accurately. His grip on Samuel loosened by a fraction. Ethan moved. Not toward Langston. Toward the space between Langston and his men at the door. Cutting the angle. Positioning himself where neither threat could reach the other without going through him first. It was an old soldier's instinct, and it worked, because both men at the door shifted uncertainly and looked at each other, and neither drew. "Samuel," Ethan said quietly, without looking away from the room. "Step away." Samuel pulled himself free and stepped back and put the bar between himself and Langston. His breathing was ragged. His eyes were furious. Langston looked at Ethan, at Lydia, at the empty saloon in the gray pre-dawn light, and Ethan watched him recalculate, watched the fury cool, just slightly, back into the thing it had briefly stopped being. The old patience returning, slower this time, less certain of itself. "This changes nothing," Langston said. "The note still comes due." "The note," Ethan said, "is the least of your problems." Langston looked at him. "Rupert left 6 days ago," Ethan said. "He's carrying survey documents and a letter from Hargrove dated 1869, acknowledging payment for falsified land records. If he's made Abilene, Marshal Holt already has it." He watched Langston's face. "You can feel it, can't you? The thing you've been afraid of for 20 years. It's already moving." The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Langston stood in the middle of the Broken Spur saloon, and the mask slipped entirely for just a moment. 3 full seconds where Ethan could see all the way down to the foundation of the man, to the thing that had been driving him since 1868, to the fear underneath the patience and the power and the 20 years of careful architecture. The fear of being nothing. Of being returned to whatever he'd been before the war and the money and the fabricated land records had built him into something. Then the mask went back on. And when it did, it was different, harder. The look of a man who has just decided that the careful approach is finished. "Kill him," Langston said. The man nearest the door reached. Ethan was faster. He crossed the distance in 2 steps and caught the man's gun hand before it cleared the holster, twisted sharply, heard something crack, and the gun was on the floor before the man finished yelling. He used the momentum to spin into the second man's draw, got inside his reach, drove an elbow up and back, and that man went down against the doorframe and stayed there. 4 seconds, both men down. Ethan straightened. His breathing was even. He looked at Langston. Langston had not moved. He was standing in the middle of the room, and his face had gone through 3 different things in 4 seconds, and landed on something that Ethan recognized. Not fear exactly, because fear implied uncertainty, and what was on Langston's face was more specific than that. It was the expression of a man confronting the exact moment when the world stops cooperating with his understanding. He reached for his own weapon. "Victor!" Lydia's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Don't!" He stopped. His hand was at his hip. He looked at her. "There are 3 windows in the saloon facing the street," she said. "Margaret Caffrey is outside the left one. Tom Briggs is across the street. The Henderson sisters are at the corner." Her voice was absolutely steady. "They've been there since before you arrived, because we knew you'd come early to avoid witnesses." She paused. "You don't have a move left. You've run out of moves." Langston looked at the windows. He looked at the 2 men on his floor. He looked at Ethan standing 10 feet away. He looked at Lydia at the bottom of the stairs, with her chin up and her eyes direct, and her father's blood in her face. He lowered his hand, and in that lowering, something enormous ended. Not cleanly. Nothing that had been building for 20 years ended cleanly. But it ended. The room felt it. Ethan felt it in his own chest, the particular release of a situation that has been coiled tight for a long time and has finally been allowed to let go. "It's over," Ethan said. Not triumphant, just true. Langston picked up his hat from the bar where he'd set it. He turned it once in his hands, and then he said something that Ethan hadn't expected and would remember for a long time afterward. "I know," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "I know it is." He walked to the door, stepped over his man on the floor, pushed out into the gray morning without looking back. The door swung shut behind him. No one in the room moved for a full 5 seconds. Then Samuel Harper sat down heavily on a bar stool and put his face in his hands. And Lydia crossed the room to him and put both arms around her father's shoulders and held on. Ethan stood where he was and looked at the door and understood that it wasn't finished. Not legally, not practically, not in any of the ways that mattered for the long term. Langston was still out there. The note was still due in 3 days. Rupert might or might not have made Abilene. The marshal might or might not be coming. But something had broken this morning that couldn't be unbroken. Langston had come in person, before dawn, with his hands on a man's collar, in front of a saloon full of the wrong kind of silence. He'd run out of the careful distance he'd always kept between himself and the things he did. And a man without distance between himself and his actions was a man who had lost the most important tool he had. The witnesses at the windows had seen it. By noon, the whole town would know. Marshal Holt arrived on the morning of day 8. He came with a deputy and a federal warrant, and the particular no-nonsense bearing of a man who had ridden 4 days in July and was not interested in pleasantries before he understood exactly what he'd ridden into. Rupert rode in beside him, trail-worn and slightly sunburned, and more alive-looking than Ethan had ever seen him, with the posture of a man who had done something significant and was trying not to show how much it had cost him. Ethan met them at the edge of town. He shook Rupert's hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. And Rupert said nothing, but his eyes said everything. Holt took the testimony in the saloon with Samuel and Lydia and Agnes Teller and Rupert, working methodically through the documents with the focused efficiency of a federal officer who recognized the weight of what was in front of him. He asked his questions without drama. He made his notes. He read the Hargrove letter twice, and the second time his jaw tightened very slightly, which was the most expression he showed for the entire 3 hours. When he was done, he sat back and looked at the assembled group. "I'm going to need Victor Langston in federal custody before the end of the day," he said. "After that, the land fraud case will take time. Months, possibly a year before the court sorts the titles. He looked at Samuel. The promissory note is part of a fraudulently constructed financial arrangement that intersects with the land fraud. I'll be recommending it be suspended, pending investigation. Samuel looked like a man who had been holding a wall up with his bare hands for 3 years, and had just been told he could stop. His face didn't collapse. He was too much of a harper for that. But something in his posture changed fundamentally. Lydia reached across the table and put her hand over her father's. Samuel turned his hand over and held on. They arrested Langston at his ranch house at 2 in the afternoon. Holt went with his deputy and 4 men that Ethan had quietly assembled that morning from the ranching families on the valley's western edge. Not as a posse, Holt was precise about that, but as witnesses to a lawful federal arrest in case anyone later disputed what had happened. Ethan rode with them. Langston came out onto his porch when he heard them in the yard. He looked at the federal marshal's badge, and then at the men behind him, and then at Ethan, and his face ran through its familiar calculation one final time, and arrived, after a long moment, at something that looked almost like resignation. "I'll need my lawyer," he said. "You'll have access to counsel," Holt said. "Today, you'll come with me." Langston looked at Ethan. "You'll be gone from this valley inside a year," he said. "Men like you always are." Ethan looked back at him steadily. "Maybe," he said, "but the Harpers will be here." Something moved across Langston's face. The last thing, Ethan thought. The thing underneath everything else. The original wound that had turned into 20 years of damage. He couldn't name it precisely. He didn't need to. Langston put on his hat and walked down off his porch and let Holt put the restraints on him without resistance. Because whatever else Victor Langston was, he was smart enough to know when the arithmetic had finally and irrevocably run out. They rode back to town. The street was full. Not a mob, nothing loud or ugly. Just people who had come outside and were standing on the boardwalks and in the doorways. The grain merchant and his wife, the blacksmith, the widow Caffrey with her hands folded and her chin up, the Henderson sisters, Tom Briggs with his arm around his wife Clara, Agnes Teller, straight-backed and silent, watching with the patient eyes of a woman who had been waiting 7 years for this exact procession to pass by. Nobody cheered. This wasn't a cheering kind of moment. It was the kind of moment that called for something quieter. The communal exhale of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Ethan rode through it and didn't look at any of them, because if he looked at them, he'd feel all of it at once, and he needed to finish the ride first. He found Lydia on the saloon's front step. She watched Langston pass with an expression he'd never seen on her. Not satisfaction, not relief, not triumph. Something more complicated and more honest than any of those. The expression of a woman who has survived something that required everything she had, and is only now, in this specific moment, allowing herself to know exactly how much it cost. He dismounted, tied his horse, walked up to where she was standing. She looked at him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She looked at the street where the dust from Holt's horses was still settling. "It won't be simple," she said. "The land cases, the title disputes, my father's finances." She folded her arms. Old habit. Then, deliberately, she unfolded them. Let her hands stay at her sides. "It's going to be a long year." "Yes," he said. "I'm going to need help." She looked at him directly. "With the saloon, with the accounts, with all of it." Her voice was careful and precise, and he knew her well enough now to hear everything underneath it. The things she was saying inside the things she was saying. "My father isn't as strong as he used to be, and I can't run it alone. And I am not asking for charity. I am offering a position with fair pay and honest work and—" "Lydia," he said. She stopped. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him. Something she'd been holding in her face for 3 weeks. Since that first night at the bar. Since the first time he'd said her name. Finally, quietly, let go. Not dramatically. Not in the way of stories that needed the moment to be large. Just the particular softening of a woman who has been guarding herself for the right reasons, and has just decided that the reasons no longer apply. "You're sure?" she said. "I've been sure," he said. "I've just been waiting for you to let me say it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and put her hand against his chest. Not a gesture of passion, not yet. Something more fundamental than that. Something that said, "You are real. This is real. I am deciding to let this be real." He put his hand over hers. They stood on the front step of the Broken Spur Saloon in the July heat, while the town of Dust Ridge slowly resumed the business of being a town that belonged to itself again. And neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything left to say that they hadn't already said in every conversation and every shared silence and every moment of working alongside each other in the last 3 weeks. Rupert started playing the piano from inside the saloon, something slow and unhurried. The first song he'd played in days that didn't feel like it was covering over something. Samuel Harper came out the front door and stopped when he saw them, and looked at his daughter's hand against Ethan's chest, and then looked up at Ethan's face. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, one firm, wordless pressure, and walked past them down the boardwalk to stand in his street and look at his town. The case against Victor Langston took 11 months. The federal court found the land fraud proven on 9 of the 11 parcels. The deed records were corrected. 4 ranching families received land they'd been dispossessed of. The promissory note against the Broken Spur Saloon was declared void as part of a fraudulently structured arrangement, and Samuel Harper burned the original copy in the fireplace on the night the ruling came through. Doyle resigned the sheriff's office in September, before the federal investigation reached his arrangements with Langston. He came to the saloon the evening of his last day and sat at the bar and ordered 1 drink and said to Ethan, without looking at him, "I should have done better." Ethan poured him his drink and said, "Yes," and left it at that, because some things didn't need more than the truth and the space to sit in it. Pruitt left the valley when Langston was arrested, and nobody heard from him again, which was probably the best outcome available for everyone, including Pruitt. Rupert kept playing piano. Agnes Teller's schoolhouse got a new roof in the fall, paid for by a community subscription that came together in 3 days and was oversubscribed by $40. Agnes cried when they told her, briefly and privately, and then went back to teaching with the same precise composure she brought to everything. By the following spring, Lydia had reorganized the Broken Spur's accounts from the ground up, negotiated new supplier contracts, and turned a profit for the first time in 4 years. She did it with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything, except that now there was someone at the other end of the bar at the end of each evening. Someone who handed her a glass of her father's good whiskey and sat with her in the quiet after closing, and was, in the specific way of a man who had spent 4 years not allowing himself to want anything, learning what it felt like to want something and have it. He wasn't loud about it. He wasn't demonstrative in the ways that stories usually were. He was simply there, steady and present, and entirely without the intention of being anywhere else. One evening in late May, with the summer heat just beginning to build again toward its annual promise of severity, Lydia sat across the back table from him, with the accounts closed and the saloon quiet, and said, "You haven't talked about Missouri in a long time." "No," he said. "Is that good?" He thought about it. About the farmland and the winter of '74, and the grave he'd left behind, and the 4 years of riding that had carried him through every kind of empty until a lame horse had stopped in front of a saloon in a dying town on a July afternoon. "It means something changed," he said. "I'm not sure it's good or bad. It's just true." She looked at him. What changed? He looked back at her, at this woman who had held a town's fear and grief in her hands and turned it into something that worked, who had walked into a corrupt sheriff's office and talked a broken man back to his own conscience, who had stood at the bottom of a staircase and told the most powerful man in the valley to his face that he'd run out of moves, who had put her hand against his chest and decided to let something be real. "I stopped being somewhere else," he said. "I'm here." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached across the table and picked up her glass. "You're here," she agreed. Outside, the summer night pressed down on Dust Ridge the way it always had and probably always would, heavy and hot and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath it. But inside the broken spur, Rupert was playing something quiet, and Samuel Harper was doing his accounts in the back, with his door open for the first time in years. And the town outside was a town that had found its way back to itself. And at the back table, in the lamplight, two people who had both spent too long surviving alone sat together in a silence that didn't need to be filled. Because some things, once found, required nothing more than the decision to stay. And Ethan Cole had finally, after 4 years and 1,000 miles of empty road, made that decision. He was staying.